So no longer is it something that one might go to a psychiatrist who would say that it's all in your head. Polyvagal theory says, hey, it's not in your head, it's in your nervous system, and it's being manifested in your organs, your gut, your heart, and you can even see it in skeletal motor. All therapists and all people who work with trauma or people even with high levels of anxiety can literally see it in the body. And polyvagal theory gives the therapist another set of clues. It says you can see it you can hear it in the voice, you can see it in the face, because the nerves that are regulating vocalization are vagal nerves. They're in parallel with the nerves that regulate our viscera, our gut, our heart.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media.
Professor Stephen Porges. I don't want to be blasphemous, but you're a god in our field, in the field of mental health and trauma. And we owe you a huge debt of gratitude for the work that you've done on the polyvagal theory. You're the founder of the polyvagal theory, which has revolutionized the way we approach and treat trauma and mental health and other forms of health as well. So I'm incredibly grateful to have you on the Mind Health 360 show. It's the second time that we've had a conversation, but now is your new book, Polyvagal Safety, Attachment, Communication, Self-Regulation. So this is your latest book. And that's what I wanted to discuss after our first interview, which was about a year ago. And just to give you a very brief sort of biog, you're a distinguished university scientist at Indiana University, where you're the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium and the Kinsey Institute. You're a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and professor emeritus at both the universities of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. You're the world's leading expert on the relationship between the autonomic nervous system, a neural system that oversees largely unconscious functions such as heart rate and digestion and social behavior. And as I was just saying, you're the creator of the groundbreaking polyvagal theory, a theory that explains how social behavior is linked to our physiology. And the theory has transformed the conceptualization of trauma treatment and has been integrated in treatment strategies by clinicians around the world. You also hold several patents involved in monitoring and regulating autonomic state with applications in mental and physical health. I'll put a lot more in the show notes. That's just sort of a brief summary. So I have so many questions for you, Stephen, and I'm just going to start by saying this new book, which is absolutely wonderful. It's very dense and full of information. Some chapters are easier than others, but some fascinating research in here and fascinating studies, which I have to say really sort of blew me away. What would you say is different and unique in this new book compared to your older ones? And, what sort of shifted in the way that you're now approaching things?
With the original book that came out in 2011, it was really even denser than this one because it was really the voice of a scientist. It was a compilation of chapters and articles that were very scientific. And it took, I would say, over a decade for me to kind of understand that this dense information had tremendous application within the clinical world. So one might say that I've been on my own internship since actually, I would say, the late 1990s, where as a scientist, I started to be invited to give talks with basically talks for therapists. And initially, I didn't know why I was in the room, basically. And then I realized that the therapists had this intuitive understanding of what polyvagal theory brought into their world. So basically, it gave them a map of what it was to be a human. But in doing that, and this is what I also say, is what have I learned from stepping into the world of trauma? I've learned that we learn what it is to be a human from those who have been traumatized. Now, let me deconstruct that, because the functions that we cherish the most are those that are compromised as a function of being traumatized. So we literally see our nervous system unfolding in a very predictable way from this social, safe organism to an organism that is in constant threat. And the physiology that goes with that is really a physiology of defense and threat. And so even though the intentional brain, our ideas, our visions, our expectations are to feel safe in the arms of another, those who have experienced severe trauma, when they try to follow the intentions of what their brain is telling you, their body rebels, pulls back, they get anxious, they get physiologically destabilized, and they can't functionally handle it. Polyvagal theory gives an explanation of that. So no longer is it something that one might go to a psychiatrist who would say that it's all in your head. Polyvagal theory says, hey, it's not in your head, it's in your nervous system, and it's being manifested in your organs, your gut, your heart, and you can even see it in skeletal motor. All therapists and all people who work with trauma, or people even with high levels of anxiety, can literally see it in the body. And polyvagal theory gives the therapist another set of clues. It says you can see it you can hear it in the voice, you can see it in the face, because the nerves that are regulating vocalization are vagal nerves. They're in parallel with the nerves that regulate our viscera, our gut, our heart. So when people's voices don't have intonation or prosody, we tend not to be attracted to them. We don't feel safe in their presence because they're broadcasting their bodily state. And so we can see it not only in their face, but their voice is powerful. And the impact of human voice on other people's physiology is powerful. And so the clinician learns about this, and the clients start to understand what it is in their body, or I would say why their body's reacting to others.
That's fascinating. And I think, for me, and I think for everyone, one of the big revolutions that your theory has brought about is the fact that, 80% of the fibers from the nerves actually are afferent, meaning that they go from the visceral organs to the brain or the brainstem rather than the other way around. And we used to think that our thoughts determined our feelings, right? But in some ways, you've turned that on its head, and you're saying actually our physiology, our state, is that what's impacting our thoughts and our feelings? Is that correct?
Well, it goes both directions, but often it gets initiated. Well, let's put it this way. The circuits that create those physiological feelings often are higher in the brain, although we're not aware of them, and they go to the gut, but we're aware of when they go to the gut. So we are, in a sense, aware of these interoceptive feelings, and then we're really at a cross point. How do we make sense of it? And we all have had feelings that we didn't know where they came from, but we were working hard to make meaning of it. And that meaning is often to basically emote or get angry at the person across the table from us. Yeah. And it might have nothing to do with that person. And once we go into that state, our face and our voice change, and suddenly that gets mirrored because the other person's physiology is now being threatened by our behavior. And now we say, see, you're angry at me, and that's why I can't handle this anymore. So it creates this kind of cycle without understanding or honoring what your body is doing. Polyvagal theory gives you that, it basically gives you a justification to stop, to basically honor what your body is trying to tell you before you tell it why it's doing something. Throw out the justifications and honor the feeling. Learn from that awareness. So the point is, yes, so much of the afferents of the vagus are sensory. Basically, visualize it as a surveillance system of our organs. And it's sending information up to the brainstem and then functionally percolating upward and influencing what areas of cortex are accessible. So we all know that when we're worked up or angry or feel bad, we don't think well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't have They didn't open, the portals are not opening. We can't perform. And we get angry at ourselves. Does that ever work? When we get angry at ourselves, we get more mobilized and the circuits shut down even more. So our strategies, which is try harder, just blame ourselves for what our body is trying to tell us. Stop for a moment. Take that breath.
Yeah. And that's so important. And I think, when you say take that breath, one of the ways that we can actually influence our system is by breathing. And you make this very clear that, in terms of measuring sort of vagal tone and measuring the state of your nervous system and then influencing it, because that's the key thing is, we can actually influence our physiological states. Because, one of the issues is that if we have a state that's in fight or flight, or that's in defense or some sort of, shutdown or in fight or flight, then it impacts our behaviors, it impacts our relationships with other people. And from the perspective of mental health, which is what I'm really interested in, we can explain a lot of mental health, sort of what we label as depression or anxiety or ADHD, as dysregulation of this system. Can you tell us a little bit about how your theory has really revolutionized our approach to mental health as well?
Well, let's just start with the word anxiety or stress. If someone says to you, you're anxious and there's no reason for you to be stressed out, how do you interpret those types of statements? You interpret them as if you are intentionally anxious or intentionally stressed out. So by using these labels, we're not respecting the process. So stress, anxiety is in our nervous system a biological threat. Our body is in a state of mobilization and preparing our bodies for fight or flight or for a sensitivity for an intruder. So we know what's going on physiologically. Let's kind of respect and say that's not the state that will facilitate social behavior, learning, or performance. So this is where your point is, we know that our body needs to calm. But it's just like a crying baby. If you yelled at the crying baby and said, stop crying, how effective is it? But think about how we self-manage ourselves. We yell at ourselves. We have that voice that says, stop doing that. We get angry. And then we say, well, if I can't stop it, I'm just going to totally ignore what my body is saying. So we numb out. And then over time, we develop strategies of dissociation from our body. And functionally, what that's doing is it's turning off those important feedback loops between our organs and our brain, and which means that the homeostatic functions of health, growth, and restoration are being compromised. But don't worry, in the mental health arena, we have words for this. We call them comorbidities. So you then have, in a sense, gut problems, see a gastroenterologist. You have heart problems, see a cardiologist. You have skin problems, see a dermatologist. You have migraine problems, see a neurologist. And rheumatoid arthritis, all these things which have important, we use term, or people will use stress-related components. But why don't we just say what it is? Our body's in a state of threat, and these systems lose their neural regulation. They stop supporting health, growth, and restoration, and we run to a physician to give us some medication to effectively turn off the symptoms, not improve the neural regulation. So we have to develop a different strategy of self-management. That's where polyvagal comes in, because it really says these systems are integrated. You don't just have a mental health issue, you have a nervous system issue. And in the world that you sit, when you talk to people who have mental health challenges, what's the probability that they also have a, quote, comorbidity?
Absolutely. Well, what fascinates me, I'm very interested in functional medicine psychiatry, which looks at sort of the biochemistry of mental health. And so it's the step it's a progress from our current model of psychiatry, which labels things as depression or anxiety and then provides a pill for it, in the sense that it looks at the biochemical dysregulation, whether it's in hormones or in toxins or in the gut or inflammation. But what's interesting to me is that all these biochemical imbalances actually are downstream from what you describe, which is your neural regulation and your nervous system equilibrium. And so really, I mean, would you say that downstream from this sort of endocrine disruption and gut disruption and inflammation is a dysregulation of the nervous system?
I would say upstream. I would say it initiates, the neural system works quickly and very fast. And if it gets locked into states of threat, then you start getting all these downstream consequences. You see it in inflammation, you see it in the endocrine system, you see it in the organs. But what they're telling you, all these indices are telling you, is that the neural regulation of the system isn't working. So even inflammation, vagal system does downregulate inflammation. So the point is that these are predictable consequences. Now, when we move into like functional medicine or any form of treatment, people say, okay, there's an imbalance. I'm going to correct that. They're not asking the right question. The imbalance is the response. It's the body is telling you that there's something coming into the body that is a threat-producing set of cues. Could be a pathogen, it might not be. It can be an association with something, a thought process that we're locked into that downregulates our physiology into the chronic state of threat. And now we're manifesting in these dysregulatory and imbalances or whatever metric we use. We published a study on basic subjective measures of autonomic regulation, trauma history, and how people's mental health is during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Okay. So the first obvious bit is based upon adversity history, your mental and basically it was depression, PTSD symptomatology, and worry. Basically, if you had a severe adversity history, it got mapped out into your symptoms. But the interesting part from a polyvagal perspective is that virtually all the variants, predictive variants of that adversity history, was accounted for by the subjective indicators of their autonomic nervous system. So it really was saying, if my trauma history retuned my autonomic nervous system, the pandemic is catastrophic to my mental health.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
And then we had, there was a couple thousand subjects, but we also did another analysis because in the first study, which was done early in the pandemic, basically most of the people, about 80% of the people didn't have COVID, but we found 100 subjects. And when you map those 100 subjects based upon adversity history, it's a very linear relationship in terms of predicting who got COVID. And the problem is we couldn't really use autonomics because when you have COVID, the autonomics get dysregulated. And the relationship between autonomics in those that got COVID and was even more impactful in terms of outcome. But I'm very cautious about those data because COVID affects the autonomic nervous system. But the interesting part was if their adversity history was beyond a certain point, they had a 75% probability of getting COVID. If it was below a certain point, it was negligible. So at that point in the pandemic, which was early, which was spring of 2020, but what it's telling you is that adversity history is a pre-existing condition for COVID because it represents a retuned autonomic nervous system.
And not just COVID. I mean, presumably COVID is sort of one example, but if you have a dysregulated nervous system with an adversity history, then you're going to be more susceptible, presumably, to any biological or psychological stressors in the same way.
Yeah, so let's go back and basically use polyvagal theory as our organizing principle. Polyvagal theory is saying that between cause and effect, or stimulus and response, or pathogen and disease, there's something in the middle. It's called your organism. It's an organismic variable. In polyvagal theory, the autonomic nervous system plays that pivotal role. And so what it's really saying is the state of my autonomic nervous system is influencing how my body processes that input. And so it means, am I resilient or not resilient? Mm-hmm. And that's like when we had a discussion about mold earlier, that was the structure. The physiology that you carry into the setting provides a prediction of how that nervous system will respond to an intruder. And similarly, we can talk about interventions. Are our bodies welcoming interventions, whether they are inoculations, surgery, or psychotherapy? Are we accessible? And that's a function of our physiology, our autonomic state. And in all these things, we want our bodies to be accessible, even to barbaric surgical procedures, if that's our last resort.
Absolutely. But I mean, it's fascinating because it does enable you to see things slightly differently. So for instance, in somebody who might have a copper poisoning from an IUD, right, which can cause psychosis and it can cause all sorts of mental health symptoms. Now you could think, okay, well, that's purely biological. I mean, it's something that's happened to this person. They've got copper in their system and it's poisoning them and creating mental health issues. Are you saying then that they would not be as susceptible to that particular toxin if their nervous system were better regulated?
I am implying that. We know that certain things like certain toxins don't have a large range of individual differences. But in the world that we live in, most things do. And so we talk, like even in the world of trauma, we know that for certain people, the event totally reframes their life, retunes their nervous system. But for other people, the actual experience of the same event is treated by them as if it were trivial. They just walk through it. And it's our worldview, which is a causality. We talk about linear processing, but it's a causal worldview which doesn't truly appreciate the intervening variables. It has a lot to do with our history and science and our Cartesian worldview. We need to have an understanding that the healing occurs in the body and is not through the outside of the body. So we think about treatments as if I'll take this and it will deal with that symptom and I'll be well. Well, you take this, the nervous system has to now incorporate that signal into building a model to, in a sense, fight the disease state or support healing. Now, we know that certain physiological states support health, growth, and restoration, and they're going to be the same ones that are going to be welcoming to any form of intervention. And when we get into the world of, let's just say, alternative medicine, we need to deconstruct them so that they fit together. And so we can talk about visualizations or top-down strategies that change our physiology and make our body more welcoming to an intervention. Simple as that.
But then so what really determines the state of your nervous system? You're saying that some people, for instance, they can experience the same stressor and have a very different reaction. Mm-hmm. Are you born with it? Is it genetic? Is it something that you learn from your mother and your parenting or whoever your caretaker is? What forms and shapes the resilience of your nervous system?
See, this is not to be critical, but even the framing of the statement is a cause and effect outside, inside modeling. So what you're really saying is, are these causes genetic? Are they experiential? Where's it all coming from? And if you shifted the thought process for a moment and said, there are different states that our nervous system can be in. It's part of our genetic heritage. We're not always in states of threat, but those states of threat are foundational survival states. And if our body basically thinks it, or let's say the body has a mind of its own and basically is detecting cues of threat when intentionally in our conscious mind they're not there, the physiology will go into a state of threat, and it's going to distort or affect the efficiency of getting that information of safety in. Mm-hmm. So it's like, we are so bombarded with a variety of models that we don't even acknowledge. So we think that, like in education, the educational world thinks that behavior is 100% intentional. So that if you're now mess up in the classroom, it's because your intentions were to mess up in the classroom. If you're not learning, it's because your intentions are not to study. And for many children, or many adults even, who have memories of going to school, their intentions were to be a good student, to basically do what teachers wanted, what their parents wanted, but their body didn't cooperate. So now they are hateful and resentful to their own body, when their body basically appropriately detected that the environment was threatening. So what we're always trying to do is saying, it's not threatening, you can do it. And what ends up is there are different strategies that different people have access to. And one that is most frequently recruited is basically numbing the process. Mm-hmm. So if I'm being yelled at, I don't hear it after a while. What's that mean? It means that the feedback loops processing auditory information are now changing. And this starts affecting how I regulate my gut, how I regulate my heart. So we're turning off neural feedback loops. Not good.
No, not.
And we start saying, well, that's because of accumulated stress. And then we come up with things that later in life, when kids kind of like pass through that, there's this hypersensitivity to everything. And now we start looking for the diagnosis of that hypersensitivity, when functionally it's a nervous system that's retuned to detect threat when there may not be any threat. And what I really want to emphasize is that there are two aspects of how, let's say at least two, how we function in the world. There is this intentional conscious brain, which paints or writes beautiful narratives. It says, I'm a hero, I'm doing all these wonderful things. And then there's the body that kind of is reflexive and can fool us. For me, I got fooled. I had to go for an MRI. I got into the MRI. I couldn't handle being in the confined area. Totally shocked me. I had no, in a sense, premonition or inclination that the confined area would trigger a panic attack. And I was totally destabilized by it because I had to go in there. You need certain things. And it wasn't that I didn't want to go in there. I was even curious, but my body said no. And this is, we're going to find other people have these stories at different times in their life. And there are things that you can do, like for an MRI, you take a drug, you're in it for an hour, no great deal. But in life, you can't just take drugs every time you have to do something or you're caught with things, because the drugs affect performance as well. So you try to have greater respect for what your body is trying to tell you.
And I think that's so important. And also, if you reframe what we label as mental health issues, so, depression, if you look at that in terms of the polyvagal theory, would you say that that's sort of shut down? It's a dorsal vagal state?
I think, so let me play around with depression, which really was, I thought, I still have an appointment in the Department of Psychiatry. But to me, the greatest surprise of, let's say, spending time in a psychiatry department was what depression was. And basically, we think depression is shut down withdrawal, but depression also has other features. You can have anxiety and be depressed. So to me, that was almost a contradiction in operational definition, because anxiety is moving, depression shutting down. And I used to say, while we were sleeping, meaning the laboratory psychophysiologists, stress researchers, while we were sleeping, psychiatry co-opted all attributes of dysregulation, all attributes of stress, and called it depression. Mm. So there is, because they start coming up, diagnoses are based on checklists created by, let's say, very bright people creating organizational models based on phenomenology, based on phenomena they see. It doesn't have a neurophysiological organizing feature. Yet in mental health, all these phenomenological clusters, people have been spending their life trying to come up with physiological or neuroanatomical or neurophysiological or genetic signatures. It's not an efficient strategy. The other strategy is to think about foundational systems that get triggered in many mental health disorders. Think of mental health as being an inverted triangle in which you have a brainstem at the bottom and have some common processes. And as it percolates up, you have higher brain systems, and they start creating different textures that we would call mental health disorders. They would be diagnostic categories. But you'd find that there are certain core features in many of them, and they have to be the body goes into a state of threat. And that is seen as sympathetic excitation, mobilization. And when that doesn't solve to get the person, quote, into a safer environment, the body shuts down. And so when you have this like bipolar depression, so where you have this manic stage and then the body shuts down, very polyvagal, because threat reactions require, in general, we think of threat reactions as fight, flight, but they're not the sole threat reaction. Shutting down, immobilization, passing out are very primitive, meaning that they're evolutionarily older. But those foundational systems are there, but the mobilization, sympathetic excitation is metabolically costly. We cannot maintain that type of activity. The body will have its own adjustment, and that is to shut down.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. So you basically would reframe all these labels of mental health as a sort of nervous system dysregulation. So the body is out of a safe state of social engagement and in some sort of defensive state of either fight or flight or shutdown.
Yeah.
And has that, do you think, what are the chances that that will get into the next DSM?
Oh, zero. But I will tell you, in 2001, when I started on this journey of deconstructing major mental health disorders from a polyvagal perspective, I was basically floored by the fact that so many of them had common features. So the diagnostics, which were supposed to be differential diagnoses, were really all based upon common features of the social engagement system not working.
Yeah.
It was as simple as that, including autism. So you start seeing all these common things, and then you start asking, why can't they restructure, they meaning psychiatry, restructure and create hierarchical models of disorders, or basically understand that when foundational systems are dysregulated, all the stuff that is really on top of it is also disorder, because it's a hierarchical model. So the problem I saw, because I was writing the grants and I was trying to get funded and all this, I said, wonderful insight. Why can't we get funded for this? And the answer was very simple: advocacy groups. So there's an identity that people have with different diseases. And psychiatry is very, including niches in which they're an expert in this. So you start getting both on the clinical side and also in terms of the patient side, defining features. So people, like in autism now, there are a lot of people who basically have a diagnosis of autism. They're functioning quite well. They have families, they work, but they don't want to give up that term because it gives them an identity. And I think other mental health issues also are used, or people tend to use them to, in a sense, feel that there is a community.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that as a potential explanation. I can think of lots of others, like the pharmaceuticals and
the pharmaceutical stuff is so neurobiologically inappropriate. One can say, yeah, there's really a real important use for pharmaceuticals for acute. You want to get the body out of dangerous states, but there's no acknowledgement that bodies or nervous systems adjust to ingestion of drugs. The receptors change. There's, in a sense, we could say that the receptors learn not to be sensitive to drugs. And so how can you basically create chronic treatment models? It just doesn't make sense. So polyvagal theory has another conceptualization, and that's neural exercises. Since what we're doing is trying to be smarter than the nervous system and titrate symptoms, wouldn't it be more efficient if we could upregulate the efficiency of the nervous system in regulating?
Well, and that brings us to the question really of what do we do about this? So, how do we, I mean, the whole point of polyvagal theory and the concept of nervous system dysregulation is how can this really shift the needle in terms of mental health treatment? And, there are obviously at the moment, the sort of gold standard of mental health treatment is SSRIs or some sort of antidepressant or mood stabilizer or a sleeping pill and some CBT. Now, what really interested me also was reading your book, how I was really struck by how cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, would really fall short as a treatment methodology for, if you take into account the polyvagal theory, because it's very cognitive and essentially, you talk a lot about the state of the therapist as well, and how important the physiological state of the therapist is, and how important to sort of compassionate listening is. And how important it is also to sort of do body therapy and somatic therapy. And so how, coming to the sort of treatment and how your theories and your can really help shift the needle in terms of mental health treatment, whether it's therapy or whether it's alternative to pharmaceuticals, what would you say to that?
Well, let's go back to CBT, because there are components in CBT, or at least I would say people where they're sneaking in certain breathing and therapeutic presence components in it. So you're starting to see a blending with our Traumatic Stress Research Consortium. We basically invited therapists from around the world to join to tell us what they were doing, what they were using, what they thought was helpful. And what we learned is the self-selected perspective of, we had 1,000 therapists who filled the questionnaires out, was the ones that were, in a sense, most beneficial had a somatic component. Often they viewed themselves as polyvagal in form, which is not a therapy, but it's really a acknowledgement of the importance of the body. Other ones were like somatic experiencing, sensory psychomotor therapy, EMDR, which has a sense of being in the body. And you start seeing to the left being less beneficial, but frequently used CBT. So the issue is people, the other important point was virtually every trauma therapist, the median number of, quote, specialties or systems that they were trained in was 8. Wow. So people are not just EMDR. They could be EMDR, somatic experience, and internal family systems. They are passionately trying to be helpful and learn. The other part that we just recently are learning is since in the world of trauma therapists often enter that area because they have a history, meaning that they have experienced trauma. And when we look at what they, as trauma therapists, they have, in a sense, since trauma therapy and therapy is actually co-regulation, when we look at their basically autonomic regulation, again through subjective measures, they are more normal than age-matched people with similar adversity histories. So they have basically, through their compassion and passion to be a trauma therapist, they're actually on a journey of self-healing by co-regulating and healing others. It's actually a very optimistic story. And the interesting part on it was the longer they have been practicing trauma therapy, the more normalized their autonomic states have become. So we start learning that, in a sense, this interaction they're having with their clients has this mutual benefit.
That's amazing. I mean, you talk about wounded healers, but that really gives a whole dimension to it. And when you talk about, measuring that neural state, how do you measure? What are the key criteria that you use to measure the efficiency or resilience of your vagal state?
Well, there are two levels. I mean, I'm a scientist, so I say get electrodes on people, or in a case like which you're familiar with is the PhysioCam, where you can measure physiology from a distance with a camera. But we can say we don't have to get that level. We can say listen to your clients, listen to the intonation of their voice, look at their facial expressivity, especially the upper part of the face. Look at their muscle tone. Basically, over time, you become a very sensitive observer of others. And then you say, how do I feel in the presence of the other? Where you're now using your body's own neuroception in which you're respecting. So we all know that when we interact with people, we say, hey, I enjoy interacting with that person. Or another response would be, look at your watch and say, time to go. When you start to query yourself and find out why is it that you like to spend time with one person, not others. It's not the intentional brain that gives you the understanding of that. So it's not the words that people say. It's really we might use the term gut feelings, your visceral reaction. And in a sense, your nervous system, your neuroception is very sensitive to the other. And that's where terms in clinical work like therapeutic presence, compassionate care, the words are there, but what we really are saying is your body, let's say, compatible and sensitive to your clients or to the other person.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's really, you made a very important point. You were talking a lot about the presence of the therapist and how important that presence was. And and the other point in terms of sort of modalities of healing, for you, really the social engagement system is where, which is when you feel safe, is where health, growth, restoration happen. That's sort of the utopia. My question is, what about people who don't, and I'm sort of talking about myself here, but people who don't gravitate towards others necessarily. And this could be for a number of reasons. One, it could be because you're depressed, and, people who are depressed actually want to stay away from other people, even though maybe it would be good for them. People who are loners and, they like being alone and they like to self-regulate and they find other people draining or needy. Or so how do you reconcile essentially the fact that the Holy Grail is the social engagement, but it doesn't always work that way?
Well, again, you don't want to blame yourself if you're uncomfortable with others, because now you create that self-fulfilling prophecy. You force yourself to interact, and you're basically broadcasting cues to the other that you're not accessible, and now it's not a good interaction. So the knee-jerk reaction to what you're saying is get a dog, have a cat, get a horse. The issue is that for many people who gravitate towards self-regulation, they do great with other social mammals. That, another mammal, I use the term mammal because I don't think, birds have the same reciprocal affect. People might argue with me, or reptiles. People get attached to all kinds of things, all kinds of animals. But what I'm saying is with a social mammal, it's easier. Dogs will come to you, they'll literally smile. If your voice goes into the wrong range, they'll look at you as if something's wrong. So they give you that reciprocity in real time in a way that your nervous system can understand. And they perform a functional neural exercise. So the answer is, don't get upset if you don't want to be with people or you feel uncomfortable, but acknowledge that co-regulation with a social mammal is healthy. And it doesn't have to be with a human. There are people who go equine therapy, and where they truly love their pets in those moments because they feel the reciprocity, and they feel that they are met on their own terms. And the issue, and this is like being present, they're It's a therapeutic presence, not with a person, but now with another social mammal. So the first thing is don't evaluate yourself as being deficient, but really understand that these opportunities are still there for you, even if you are uncomfortable with humans.
Well, that's a great point. And in your book, when you talk about contemplative practices and mindfulness practices, I thought that was very interesting because you were saying that the sort of context of contemplative practices, where you have the silence and you're in a sort of space of stillness. And then you have the rituals. So you have the prayer and the meditation and the breathing and the chanting. And in some sense, these perform the same effects as the social engagement. They can get you into social engagement even if there's no one else around. Is that correct?
Well, they create boundaries or as long. So like part of the whole issue with ritual is that you're giving up your vigilance. You no longer have to worry. So, that's, I described like cathedrals were fortresses, and basically they let light in, but you couldn't see through the windows. So it was the ability to feel safe, that you weren't going to be injured if you go into that mental or that state, that contemplative state. I think we have spent a very little time in our culture basically describing environments and where our bodies feel safe enough to be still.
Yes.
And if you go start talking to individuals who have mental health issues, stillness is a fearful state because it's like saying, I'm giving up my defenses. And if I give up my defenses, I have only one thing left, and that's to sink into the abyss, to disappear, which is to dissociate. And that's what they'll tell you. So we need to basically have this accessibility to stillness without it triggering these defensive states.
And it's interesting because, our culture is so riddled with busyness and with sort of adrenaline junkies and people who are constantly have a badge of honor at being busy all the time. And you wonder, that motor, what's driving them? And, some people can't seem to slow down and they find stillness very, very threatening.
Yeah.
So would you... Is that sort of a pathology in some sense? I mean, I know you don't.
We don't like using that word. So the way you could phrase it, does that have an adaptive function?
Right.
The adaptive function is you're not going to slide into the abyss. You're going to keep moving. And so people, if we think about it like, quote, workaholics, go back and kind of find out, is there a trauma history? Is there, really? And the answer is usually there's something. And as long as they keep moving, they're fine. Now, the problem is that this is culturally rewarded. And if we don't want to be a workaholic in certain environments, and I talk about an academic environment, we're not taking our work seriously. I mean, the words that are used in an academic setting are, let me just say the word interesting, because they're not words of compassion, caring, and mutual support. They're words of bullying and shaming to increase productivity.
Absolutely.
And the issue is that here's the paradox. Productivity is not equivalent to creativity, okay? We can press the lever more rapidly, but we can't solve the big problems. So how does the academic world deal with that? Well, they said, well, big problems aren't our domain. We'll deal with little things. And that's why, so much of the scientific literature doesn't generalize to big real world problems.
And it's not just academia. I think there are so many areas that are truly sort of plagued by workaholism. And as you say, our society rewards it. What is the solution for people who feel that they can't slow down and they can't be still? I mean, being still is such a gift. What is the solution to enable people to be able to be more comfortable in their state of stillness or in their state of solitude? What are the practical things that people can do? Are they neural exercises? I mean,
well, let's basically be careful because, there are people listening. Yeah, because we're having our conversation and there are people listening because many of them will have difficulty in implementing stillness. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you start giving people, let's say, tools to enter stillness and they're functionally not prepared for it, it's going to create feelings in their body of great threat. It's going to be a discontinuity. It's going to violate their expectancy. So if their body goes into a state of stillness, their nervous system is going to really interpret it as something very bad. They're not ready for it. So there are situations, so many people with these types of nervous systems actually end up trying to titrate those feelings through yoga. So the world of yoga actually has a significant percentage of people with severe trauma histories, because yoga has community, it has breath practices, and it has the individual speed that you want to go into it. So it enables this movement. And it enables movement, so when people are even going into stillness, they can then move. So when we start talking about mindfulness exercises, which often assume that everyone can go into states of stillness, what do we find out with people with severe trauma? They close their eyes, take a couple of breaths, and they're out of there. Yeah. Because the body is under too much threat when it gives up its defenses. But if they were, in a sense, in a yoga studio, or yoga class, they might be able to titrate these systems more. So the important part is not that we have exercises, and this is the world of people who want to hack their nervous system, but that we appreciate and honor that we have different nervous systems, being they're locked into different states. Some are states that have accessibility and are welcoming to these experiences. Others say, I can't violate what I have. I can't do something different. And those are the workaholics. So if you take, in a sense, the cell phone away from a workaholic or the internet, I would hate to tell you that I had a couple of internet failures and very disruptive, very, very disruptive during this period of time, because for me, my whole world is connected through the internet now. And so social world, work world, and it was extremely unsettling. Mm-hmm. And so you can start seeing how this can be disruptive. And I'm far from a workaholic at this stage of my life, but I work a lot. Yeah. But I also listen to my body. And this is part of really, I think, is a total take-home message. There are times when I say, that's all I can do. That's enough. Yeah. And then what is it that I want to do? I want to watch a mindless, crappy movie. I don't want to even be involved with the characters. I just want something that I'm not involved. I want it to be light and pass through. Now, this creates a little bit of discord because Sue doesn't like the crappy movies. Okay, she likes if she's going to watch, she wants to watch something that has, let's say, some meat in it. And I'm saying I'm watching this for a self-regulatory strategy.
Yeah, fair enough. And a lot of people do that, and there are plenty of crappy movies on Netflix.
This is wonderful now with all the streaming. There are a lot of crappy movies.
I agree. I mean, the other day I had COVID, and I was just saying I just want to watch something really mindless.
Yeah, they're there. You can watch this.
They are there. And then, speaking of the internet and social media, because that brings me to something. You talk a lot about facial expressions, eye contact. The prosody of the voice in terms of social engagement and the importance of that sort of face-to-face interaction to co-regulate. Given that our kids and our teenagers and even ourselves spend so much time online with our faces buried in a phone, on social media, scrolling through TikTok, what are the long-term impacts of this from a polyvagal perspective?
Okay, we're going to, before we get really depressed or pessimistic about life, we're going to basically say our nervous system is very flexible. We're a very adaptive species. So it doesn't mean the problem we have is that if something impacts on our nervous system, we start to think of it as destiny or fatality, or it's fatalism, when it really triggers a state that we're in and we have the resilience to be triggered out of it. So there's an interesting thing with screens, and there's an interesting thing regarding the size of the screen. So if you look at people's faces looking at small screens like an iPhone,
Right.
you don't see happy faces.
No.
You see, because the field of view is small and they're focused inward. But if you put, like, you're on a 27-inch iMac, you're almost lifelike to me. So there's a different experience for me. And even when I do podcasts on a laptop, it's not the same as doing it on the big screen. And the iPad is better than the phone, but the phone's not very good for what I experience. Now, young people are, I would say, more flexible, which may mean more resilient, and they do things on the iPhone that I would never do. So the issue is, it's a portal of social communication. I think the real question, I don't have the answer, and that is, since so much of the social interaction of younger people is through electronic means and not face-to-face, what's the long-term effect on their nervous system? There was even a study that showed that 25% of individuals, let's say 18 to 25, were texting while having sex.
Wow.
And that kind of tells you something, because this concept of intimacy is this ability to give up vigilance, give up attentiveness, to experience the presence of another. Whether we call it sex or intimacy, it's bodies conforming, meaning giving up vigilance. If you're texting, you're not there. Mm-hmm. So it's compromising the range of experiences that we're wired to enjoy, to have. So I think this technology has an important part in our lives, but the question is, can we? Okay, here's the question for you: can you go anywhere without your cell phone?
No.
What's your narrative? So what's the why? You have children. Do you have children? And you can't. Is that your narrative?
That's the excuse, yeah.
Yeah. My narrative is my wife or my kids. How often do they actually call?
Hardly ever.
Yeah, but our narrative's still the same in case we need to be reached. Mm-hmm. But what we've done is stayed in the state of vigilance. Now, there are cases, like I have a very good friend whose son has let's say, psychotic vulnerabilities, and he goes to bed with his phone because he wants to be there if his son needs him. So we start understanding why some people do that. But is this the requirement for all of us? Do we have time off?
Well, yeah. And that, I mean, time off is key in the way, when you're talking, I think a lot about the overstimulation that we also have in our 24/7 societies. And surely that also is having a very wearing effect on our physiology, because we're never off. We're never.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. So if we go back or unwind like 20 or 30 years ago, I knew academics who would go on vacation. They wouldn't even have a telephone. They'd have to walk down to a store once a week and see if they had any messages. Can any of us do that now?
No, absolutely not. But what are the effects of that physiologically? I mean, are we going to adapt, or is it?
Well, let's put it this way. We start off by saying that we are adaptive and flexible. But what we're saying is, as long as we're in states of hypervigilance, our nervous system is in a state of threat. So it's not relaxed sufficiently to support growth and restoration in our health. So you would call it stress, but basically it disrupts homeostasis from a polyvagal perspective. And unless we understand that and respect that, we're going to end up with what we would call psychosomatic illness, which are not psychosomatic. They're real illnesses, because what we're doing is turning off our neural feedback loops.
And it's very interesting because you talk a lot about sort of the different, traditionally we've measured stress in terms of sort of adrenal hormones and cortisol and dysregulation in the HPA axis. And you propose a slightly different way of measuring stress, which is in sort of vagal tone, if I understand correctly, but you will correct me, and RSA, which is respiratory sinus arrhythmia.
Yeah, I would simplify it and say that stress is a disruption of homeostatic function chronically.
Okay.
The disruption of homeostatic function is normal. That's exercise, that's play, but it recovers. And if we don't have opportunities for recovery, the system gets locked into disruption of homeostasis, meaning the body's not supporting itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what stress is. So one can get rid of this HPA axis, get rid of terms like good stress and bad stress, and basically say, is my body locked into a state of threat? Or is it just a transition in which I'm mobilized? And we call that play. I exercise. Of course, I'm not supporting homeostasis on the elliptical. It's a change. But when I get off of it, guess what? My body's recovering. And this is good. It's a neural exercise.
Exactly. It's very interesting because you talk, I was thinking when I was reading your book about hormesis, the concept of hormesis, which is essentially stress that's good for you. So whether it's you're in a freezing cold bath like Wim Hof, or you're in a boiling hot sauna, even they say that things like eating vegetables cause hormesis because they're these sort of slight poisons in vegetables that stimulate your stress response. And so in some sense, it's the transition, because, it's not just being in the state of safety where it's growth, repair, and healing, but maybe it's more about the transition between states.
Yes, exactly. So when we start looking at levels as defining stress, we get really messed up because we're really going to study the dynamic response. Does it recover? If it recovers, how can it be stress? So, and that it's like a Wim Hof model. It's not like you're in ice water and you don't recover. It's that you go into that and your body functionally has a learning curve of homeostatic adjustments. That's a neural exercise. So probably walking over burning embers is the same thing. It's, of course, your skin has to tolerate that. But the issue is the body learns to deal with what are apparent threats, but it learns that those apparent threats are transitory, and the body then recovers. The issue is when the body doesn't have the expectation of them being transitory and then gets locked into this state of compromise.
And so it's really the resilience of going back and forth between the states, and that effectively demonstrates health or lack of health.
Yeah, well, the term frequently used in the research literature is recovery, the recovery limb, the recovery function. And for those who exercise, it's like you get your heart rate up, but does it go down? It's like, I got my heart rate up to 160, but that's not the question. Yeah. How long did it take for it to get back to 70?
Yeah.
And when you're in very good shape, it goes down very quickly. When you're not, it gets locked up at high levels and stays there for hours. So that's the difference. That's fitness. So we come up with all these, constructs: fitness, recovery, stress. We come up, all we're really asking is, did I disrupt homeostatic function? Yes. For how long?
Mm-hmm. And that's key. And one of the things you point out also is that when we look at organ dysfunction, we don't look at sort of what's preceded the organ dysfunction in terms of the sort of states of stress on the organ that then are causal to the organ dysfunction. You make that.
Well, the history goes the fact that internal medicine, which just focuses on these organs, doesn't have any measures of neuroregulation of the organ except for heart rate variability, which was getting a vagal regulation of the heart. But in general, it's looking at the end organ as the site of disease. And frequently you have all these massive symptoms of end organ dysfunction without end organ disease. And that dysfunction is really the antecedent to end organ damage because the dysfunction is neural. And the conceptualization within contemporary medicine is they don't have measures, they're not taught about it. And for some physicians, that means it doesn't exist. So,
And the neural disruption essentially has very real physiological components. So, when you're in a safe state, when you're in social engagement, you have reduced cytokines, you have reduced inflammation, you have reduced cortisol, your gut is in better shape. Could you talk us through a little bit the biochemistry of being in these safe states that then protects the organs and allows for health, growth, and repair?
well, what we're really saying is when you trigger the ventral vagal complex, and this is where that cardioinhibitory myelinated mammalian vagus comes from, which basically tells the organs that everything is good. It even sends a cue down to your enteric system. Even though it doesn't regulate the enteric, it tells the enteric, get on with the job. It's meaning that a part of threat interferes with enteric function. It's inhibiting of enteric. So our system either will dump its resource down there or will lock and become constipated. So then, and the other part is that vagal function, when things are working in a homeostatic way, vagal pathways are anti-inflammatory. They have basically they have neurons that actually act to reduce inflammation. So you start seeing this whole picture of inflammation, of sympathetic overdrive or adrenal hormones as really occurring when that ventral vagal system is not working. But from a clinical and self perspective, that's manifested in the face. We know when people aren't feeling well by looking at their face.
Interesting.
We know that intonation of voice tells us a lot about their health. And we know that many people who are in these states of challenge, that they have difficulty understanding what we're saying to them because their nervous system is tuned to detect predator sounds, background noises, and not human voice. So we see it in the texture of the interaction. And so it's very obvious in the way that people relate to each other that we get a lot of information about the status of the nervous system. Not 100%, but we can see the component of whether the body is absorbing and processing cues of safety that would support these homeostatic functions. And part of those homeostatic functions will be to reduce inflammation and downregulate our defenses. So basically, what I am now talking about, I talk about social behavior or sociality as being a neuromodulator, elevating it to the level of neuromodulation. And I think what's happened in our healthcare professions is that we've minimized the importance of sociality. And this includes on the side of the therapist or the physician, that cues of safety support the healing process, cues of threat get in the way. It doesn't mean that there isn't a organ that needs to be healed. It's saying, what are the portals that facilitate that healing?
I mean, it's, having watched my mother die in a terrible hospital in the south of France where, she was tied up and treated absolutely horrendously. You just think, how can a hospital, which is meant to save people, treat people so badly that, that's just so antithetical to healing? And I think in schools, it can be similar as well. There's a focus on discipline maybe and punishment as opposed to play. And so I think the institutions in our society need to be a lot more polyvagal informed.
Yeah, well, I would say that. But during COVID, where they basically allowed people to die without their loved ones at the side, is the same issue.
Terrible. Absolutely.
And I mean, there are many stories about this. And it's not because there was bad intention, but it's because we tend to think of the ill individual as separate from the social network from which that ill individual comes from.
Right, absolutely. Now, Stephen, I'm very conscious that we're running over slightly, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but I just have a couple more questions very quickly. One of them is you talk a lot about the auditory nerve, and I know that you've developed this fantastic safe and sound protocol to help, regulate people's nervous system via auditory means. What about olfactory? Because I find the smells are incredibly triggering, both in a good way, but also very much in a bad way. And I know that people with multiple chemical sensitivities can be very triggered by smells. You don't talk so much about the olfactory, and so I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, you can start by asking me why.
Why? Tell me why.
Okay, the reason why is the auditory pathway recruits the middle ear muscles, which are regulated by the ventral vagal complex. So it's all integrated into a specific part of the brainstem that regulates striated muscle, the face and head, and the cardioinhibitory regulation of the viscera through that ventral vagus. So it's a tightly knit system. When we move to olfactory, it's not the same system. And when we move to visual input, it's not the same system. So it doesn't mean they're not related or they're not impactful. It's just not organized in the same way. When we use the safe and sound protocol, the agenda is to use acoustic stimulation to feed back and calm the nervous system. And that's in part because it's not only influencing the ventral vagal control, it's also regulating the striated muscles of the middle ear. And it's a different conceptualization of vagal stimulation. It says that if I can trigger any part of the ventral vagal complex, I'm impacting on the cardioinhibitory vagal activity. So it becomes an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator, and actually a claim was awarded when it received the patent as an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. So it's understanding the feedback loop. You can recruit the system. So it's conceptualization. Now, when we develop this ventral vagal acoustic intervention, one of the symptoms that gets reduced is visual hypersensitivity. So now we go into a system that is not predicted to change, but could be predicted if you understand the mechanisms. What controls pupil dilation? It's a cholinergic parasympathetic reaction. So if we increase the vagal activity or calm that part of the parasympathetic nervous system, it's also now impacting on general cholinergic or parasympathetic activity. Okay. And I was really kind of pleasantly surprised to see this, but I had not anticipated it.
Okay. And so the safe and sound protocol is a very good way of increasing vagal tone and sort of balancing the nervous system. Are there any other interventions?
Well, let me basically give a caveat here, because again, you're right, but there's also a cautiousness, and that is what I learned from the trauma community was that cues of safety, and I viewed the safe and sound protocol as distilled cues of trust. So now you're telling the body it's okay to be safe. And when we deal with individuals with severe trauma histories, what's the consequence? The body becomes safe. The interoception is now interpreted as vulnerability, and that results in a reaction, which may be anxiety or destabilization. And once the trauma community got a handle on this, they were able to titrate the presentation of the safe and sound protocol to accelerate other forms of trauma treatment. So they basically use it as a neural exercise, engaging the system and dealing with a lot of psychoeducation and self-awareness of this physiological shift until the people were now able to tolerate longer and longer periods of cues of safety. And the metaphor for that is like, you have a severe trauma history and I want to give you a hug. You want me to give you a hug, but your body says, that's not what, I can't handle it. Yeah. It's the same thing with other cues of trust and safety. The body says, oh, I can't deal with that. I'm out of there. Not that I don't want it. So we want to understand that sometimes the good intentions of both therapist and the client may not be appropriate at that time immediately for the client.
Yeah, and people have paradoxical responses depending on their sort of history, their trauma history.
Right. And I don't even like to use the word paradoxical. I would say very predictable. And the issue is, if my body has been violated when I trusted someone, why would I trust someone again?
Absolutely.
And that's the reaction. I'm getting out of there. And a lot of people who have had traumatic relationships, in their mind, they want new relationships with this image of safety and hugging and all the wonderful aspects. But when they get there, their body says, too much for me. I'm out of here.
Well, this is the interesting thing. I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, we talk about avoidance and addiction, love avoidance, love addiction, and how do you reframe that in terms of the polyvagal theory? I mean, is avoidance, because you talk about avoidance as a sort of sympathetic reaction when it's a defensive reaction. And would you talk about that in the context of relationships? When you're avoidant in a relationship, is that driven by a sort of problems in your childhood with relationships that were overwhelming?
Well, I don't go there because those narratives can be very, very complicated and they may or may not be true. Mm-hmm. I basically say that what we're learning is that your body's in a state of threat.
Yeah.
Don't have to give me the narrative. Your body's in a state of threat. There can be antecedent history of this. It probably is. But blaming or coming up with this complex narrative is not going to get you out of that state. To get out of that state is to honor that the fact that your body is in that state, not to get angry at yourself. Yeah. And to say, look, that state has fantastic adaptive functions, but not for close relationships. So you don't get angry at that state. You say, it's just the wrong state at this time. Can we, in a sense, navigate? And this is, in a sense, parts like internal family systems, because often the parts are really different. It's a different label for being in a different polyvagal state. So that could be viewed as parts as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good point. And then my final question is about compassion versus empathy. You talk about this in this beautiful chapter, and you talk about compassion being a sort of social engagement state, a safe state, versus empathy, which actually triggers the sympathetic system. I was fascinated by this. Talk to us a little bit about
It's actually a distinction that doesn't go well with many of my colleagues. So I will tell you that to start with, because they're very vested in the words that they use to define or describe their types of therapies. And they like to use the word empathic as a very positive attribute. I said, empathy is dangerous. And when you talk to people who have lived through severe traumas, complex trauma, what they will also tell you is they don't like to talk about it because the other person will react to what they're talking about. So they, in a sense, feel that they're hurting the observer by telling them. So that tells you that empathy of trauma is not the way to go. But if the person can be present, and I use the word compassionate, which is respectful of the other, give the other person a voice, be a better witness, not empathic in the sense that you share their feelings, but that you respect their feelings and you're present and you give, through presence, you give the support, then it works. So I would have these discussions with my colleagues who would use the word empathic therapy. I said, hey, you're not empathic, you're compassionate. It's actually a higher level. It's this ability to be there and to be supportive of the pain and trauma of your friends, your clients, and not to react to it, because if you react to it, you're going to, in a sense, trigger in them. And that leads to this next question, where part of the world of compassion believes that correcting the treatment of others is part of being compassionate. And I say that's not it. Your job is to witness. Your job is to support. And again, when you talk to people in the world of trauma, meaning those who have suffered severe traumas, the priority of retribution is very low. What they want is a voice. They want their voice. They want to be witnessed. It's not the same as imprisoning the perpetrator. It's the people are bad that have done these things. We're not supporting them, but we're saying the priority is to make the survivor feel whole again.
Yeah, and it's very beautiful. And I mean, when you talk about compassionate therapy, it also makes me think of compassionate parenting or compassionate caregiving, is being able to witness someone else's emotion or your child's emotion without it affecting you so much that you get upset, which then changes your state, which then is not good for your child, right?
Well, I'm going to say it's not good for your child, but we're all human, okay?
Yeah.
and so we're also, if we're spouses, we're human. If we're friends, we're human, which means that certain cues are going to trigger us and we're going to react. And we have to acknowledge that will occur. And we have to learn to be aware of that and navigate that and use what I call our big brains to create context in which this is minimized.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I must say, Stephen, you're such a wealth of knowledge and fascinating insight, and you're just so wonderful. And everyone is so grateful to you for the work that you've done, which is groundbreaking and so important. Is there anything that we have not covered that you think we need to cover?
Well, the only thing I would really like to say is that give people an optimistic spin. We're a flexible species. We're also a traumatized species. And what that really means is that we can go through different states. And sometimes we get kind of locked into like a state of threat, but it doesn't mean that we're there for life. And our nervous system can be retuned to be more accessible to others. And I would say, the go-to state that we want to optimize or go towards is, can we co-regulate with an appropriate mammal? Going back to our other statement, a horse, dog is really a good start, but it enables people to share, and sharing is important in life.
And what about co-regulation with the self? I mean, the holy grail of therapy is sort of the relationship with the self, the connection to the self. How do you fit that into the context of the holy grail of social engagement?
Okay, the deconstruction of that is that we become aware of our body and we respect our body. So it's the co-regulation is really intentional mind and visceral feedback. And it gets translated into what is now being called re-embodiment or embodiment. So since so much of a societal growth is a dissociative growth of basically not listening to our body, we need this co-regulation in which the intentional and aware mind becomes conscious of and respectful of our bodily states.
That's fantastic. Well, that is a great place to end, I think. And but I can't thank you enough for your time, Stephen. Thank you. And beautiful book, very dense, but absolutely beautiful, and some really fantastic points about yoga and obviously the science of polyvagal theory and contemplation and mindfulness and stillness and all these amazing concepts. Each chapter is incredibly rich and dense and wonderful. So thank you so much, Stephen, for your time.
Well, thank you, Kiki. It's good seeing you again. Hopefully you'll be in person next time.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.